Okay.
Yeah, it did show.
Now I'm going to put up our screen, wherever it is.
Yeah, okay.
This, everyone, is the landscape that our speaker, Grace Dillon, will be speaking about. And I'm going to put up our front screen because this isn't it. So I just have to move this, but this is her mountain, and she'll be talking about her mountain and her nearby, the surroundings that she lives in. Hold on. First, I have to put this away. Okay. So once again, welcome everyone to our February 5th. Oh, it says January 8th, forget that. February 5th Zoom session of the Tucson Hard Science Fiction writers, readers, and artists. Woo! And today we're having Grace Dillon. And I will stop that share so that we can see each other once again. And turn it over to, well, first introduce Grace. Grace is the professor of Indigenous Studies at Portland State. Is that right, Grace?
Yes,
She-
Indigenous
yes,
Science
and she has done many things of note, including working with me on orbiting Ray Bradbury's Mars when she wrote an essay about reading the Martian Chronicles on and off the reservation as she was growing up. And she uses the term survivance stories that comes from Gerald Vizenor, who is one of her nation, the Anishinaabe Nation. And he has spoken to, I'm sure she'll say more about this. But in her own right, she has edited the first ever Indigenous Science Fiction collection called Walking the Clouds that was put out by University of Arizona Press, I'm happy to say. And that was, what year was that, Grace?
2012.
2012, the same year as our other book on orbiting Ray Bradbury's Mars. So she has many, many credentials, but she's also a very wonderful spokesman for Native Americans and especially Indigenous people all over the world in science fiction. So now I will turn it over to Grace. There you go.
Che Miigwech, thank you very much. I would love to give a land acknowledgement to my own area. I'm a grateful Anishinaabe guest. My family is from Bay Mills Nation, Garden River Nation in Ontario. And then also I have aunties and uncles at the Sioux, Saulteaux Nation in Ontario too. And I'm very grateful to be in these lands of the Multnomah, Claflamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kayapula, and other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We work together, hopefully, to honor their ancestors, their lives, their descendants, and ours as well. And I have way too lengthy a paper here to read, so I'm going to skip around a little bit based on the wonderful conversation that was elicited at the beginning. And so before going into this, I just wanted to suggest that, and we're publishing it this May 2022, the Routledge Handbook of CoFuturisms. CoFuturisms is a combination of a word from Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, who is an Indian professor at the University of Oslo, and who has written wonderful, wonderful articles at length, and has websites and has all kinds of spots for what he calls co-futures. Then there's what is often referred to now as BIPOC futurisms, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color futurisms. And one thing that I would like to suggest is to invert a little bit, rather than viewing these futurisms as somehow smaller subsets of science fiction. actually these futurisms are much, much more pervasive in many ways than just SF. It often becomes what we call speculative or indige speculative kinds, where it combines the fantastic. And we're really interested, by the way, as Helen Hegg Brown, Chakotay Nation, has said with her film, The Cave, which she did entirely in the Chakotay language and was one of the first science fiction shorts in 2010. And as she and I have had many conversations, and this is now repeated, I'm very grateful to hear from others. She was trying to sort out how to do this Lars von Trier experiment with getting out of her own documentary element from an Indigenous feminist perspective, and was asked to create a science fiction film. And so she contacted me, and we had many discussions. And what I really loved is, after I, trying to hesitantly describe this and that, she said, "Oh," she giggled and laughed and said, "Oh, you mean just take the fiction out of science fiction?" And I said, "Yes, that's it." So I wanted to bring that up right away. Because for us, that is our science fiction, is we're actually taking the fiction out of science fiction. Yeah, Gloria? Did you want to
I have a
say
question, because I was going to try to look her up, and I'll occasionally try to put things in the chat that people might want, and I could save the chat. If you can spell her name, Helen's name, for me.
Sure. It's Helen, and then Haig, Haig, and then Brown.
Broun. Okay.
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep. And she's known for, in English, it translates to The Cave. And that film may be available. It goes back and forth, but it may be available for free online to take a look at. And
I see it here.
yeah, I think, though, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to dash into some of these things, just because and then you guys just tell me when to quit. Then we could just kind of talk together. One thing I wanted to note is that more and more of our stories and our novels, speaking of taking that fiction out of science fiction, we're really looking at integrated forms of climate and environmental justice. And that the stories themselves, in fact, become that kind of form. We'll talk about Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future at some other point. I gave an entire talk on that at SFRA. And while I love him dearly, and I've brought him out to visit, and he spent time with one of our Indigenous nations for a period of 6 weeks for the Years of Rice and Salt, he still gets a little off. And that shows up in Ministry of the Future, so that it's the cowboys that are clearly non-native that are dancing in and bringing the buffalo, rather than the kind of land back claims that we are often employing in science fiction. That becomes a very strong part of that as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention for the person was a Coster, who's working with African Futurisms and had met Nnedi Okorafor or has read her stuff, that The indigenous sciences, once you get into them, have to be, of course, very local, very specific. So it was wonderful, Gloria, that you gave us the image of the place where I'm at. And we have old growth trees. We actually have a tree in our front yard that the elders of Grand Ronde Nation have come and said they had planted, and they have the story of having planted in that area over 500 years ago. And that's how old that tree is. And we had some environmental scientists come out. It can be difficult to date a tree without cutting it down, but they absolutely agreed that it was easily a 500-year-old tree. And we have every spring, our coyotes come out and they dance around the tree for one night, and will urinate against the tree while they're dancing. And they literally form a circle around the tree. This has happened every year. We keep an eye out for it now. And then they leave. And and we respect them as animal persons, giving their story or their song, because they're in full throat, right? You know, as they're singing and dancing. And so it's something that we now look forward to each year. Well, one feature that stands out as the editors Isaiah Lavender III, Bodie, who I already mentioned, and Taryn Taylor, who's Latinx Panamanian, and Isaiah is Black American. We are putting out the Routledge Handbook of CoFuturisms. And as I said, it involves specifically BIPOC futurisms, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. But we realize that sometimes that can come across internationally as a little too US centric. And so we're fusing that together with Bodhi's sense of co-futures. So our handbook is the Handbook of CoFuturisms. What does stand out as an overall feature is, and you may recall Sammy Schock's wonderful, wonderful book, taking a look at Afrofuturisms through the eyes of, and I put this in parentheses, disabled, right, studies, perspective. And in her now famous book on especially Afrofuturisms and African futurisms, she brings in this idea of body-mind as a fusion. Now that immediately is controversial in connection with the old days of cyberpunk, which is when I grew up in the 80s, where there was such a tension between the mind and the body, or there was a tension between science and art. Well, as I'll be getting into a little bit, hopefully with a few features here, first of all, BIPOC and co-futurisms have in general, and this includes Asian futurisms, Israeli futurisms, Gulf futurisms, Gulf or Arabic futurisms. So there's all kinds. Body, mind, spirit as a fusion. It's not something that you separate or divide against each other or have as opposing qualities to each other. which often through the English language can create those almost kind of false sense of binaries, right? And for so many of us in our BIPOC communities and in our Indigenous communities as a whole, that kind of division doesn't make sense for us. The word, in fact, that we use in my own Anishinaabe language, which I grew up with speaking as a little one, I'm very fortunate to have done so. But one thing that I knew about, and then kind of figured out later on that it actually was a different way of thinking, is this idea that body, mind, spirit is fused together at all times. You're not separating them. But the same is true for our wording for an artist, a writer, or a scientist. We actually use the same expression for all three. So whether we regard you as an artist if you are a scientist. Yeah, Gloria, you look like you've got something.
Is that word? I'm curious. What is the word for those three?
How about if I give that to you later? Because I probably should like dash through these. But yes, I'll be sure to give you that terminology. And I'll be giving it from my Bawating dialect, which is not really put in print. An uncle and my daughter and I and some others are working on putting it into print as we speak. It's going to be quite a project. Dar Jamal and the End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption 2019 reports on the catastrophic disruption involving trips to the front lines of collapsing geo and biospheres, and interview and reports about near apocalyptic scenarios, about rapidly thawing permafrost, the release of methane into the atmosphere, the flooding of coastal cities, the increasing likelihood of billions of people dying in the not so distant future, and his reluctance, he says, to even write and publish the book after he went through with this. He knows that one runs through what is called the praise of grief. And this is an expression that Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, spoke of his own father, who, and I noticed that there is a physician here, his father was an excellent diagnostician and scientist back in the 1980s, who worried that we were then at a point of no return. But rather than give in to depression, as Indigenous peoples, we've had over 500 plus years of resistance in many places. Rushworth said that even with this certainty in mind, quote, we have to do our best every day, even if it all goes down. It's a matter of personal dignity to do everything we can to turn it around, because you never know, you never really know, unquote. And so that's something that he learned from his dad and passed on. This Cherokee elder back in the 1980s reflects the stance of decolonizing the Anthropocene, one that does not deny nor is blinded to this potential sixth age of extinction, and I would say it is the sixth age of extinction, created largely by man as a geological force. But in spite of that, with dignity and humility, to not give up and try every day to impact as people of good intentions. And that, by the way, is the very meaning of our being Anishinaabe people, is people of good intentions. And we tend to joke a lot. I have a family of 9 where there's just lots of laughter going on all the time. And so one of our jokes is, Well, we're people of good intentions. Now, that doesn't mean we'll always follow through on that good intention. But that, of course, is the exercise, right? Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland and United Nations envoy on climate change and climate justice, hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future, speaks of her own decade of meeting with those suffering the worst effects of climate change. Drought-stricken farmers in Uganda, a president struggling to save his sinking South Pacific island nation, Honduran woman pleading for water. I would add to this the 2019 report, and then later on he turned it into a book by Jacob Sakharov, who did work in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where attempted migrations to the US for asylum were far more dependent in his studies, when he paid close attention to it, were far more dependent on the 4 to 5 year drought that heavily impacted their coffee beans, hit also by a strange new fungus, and their maize or corn than by other factors often stated explicitly. And you'll recall this is from the former White House administration in 2018, where they were actually busy covering up this report. And then journalists uncovered it in the month of September 2019. And they uncovered it to show some of the repercussions of climate injustice as the peoples of these countries are now starving in vast numbers and are fleeing for asylum. As Mary Robinson notes, they come from communities that are the least responsible for the pollution warming our planet, yet are the most affected. Their stories of over a decade made her realize that the fight about climate change is fundamentally about human rights. Now, I'm going to add to Mary, I have an Irish husband, and that's my Dillon last name. I'm going to add that it's not just about human rights, it's about rights of animal persons, rights of plant persons, rights of phenomenological persons, like the Ana tornado that was just referenced, for us, that has a personhood and a being, and is to be therefore treated as kin and treated as important to have relationships with and work with. So she's talking about human rights, but for us, it's Nibi, water rights, it's Aki, land rights, it's Mother Nature, Mitsukumekwa rights. And that is important for us to all be aware and conscious of that common pot. So she says they must also be able to, for those that are impact vulnerable countries and communities that are suffering from this and are usually the least culpable for the problem, they must be also able to share not only the burdens, but also the benefits of climate change fairly. This, she says, I call climate justice, putting people at the heart of the solution. And for us, as I would say, we would be adding in all the features of animal persons, plant persons, star persons. You know, there's a personhood for everything, right? Just 2 to 3 years later this summer, we experienced 109 to 118 degrees Fahrenheit in our coastal and mountainous areas of Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver, BC, which for some of you is not going to sound very high at all. But for us was, struck us with consternation. Where our family lives, with most homes not constructed for any form of air conditioning and cooling centers that were suddenly created for urban peoples, who often could not make a metro rail system that broke down from the heat, the melting of, while power outages became a norm in the city of Portland. And so over 1,000 people died, while billions of sea creatures were exterminated in the deadly heat that lasted for a week and a half or so this past early summer. Following that, Hurricane Ida caused scenes like homes in Hammond and New Orleans, Louisiana, both flooded and on fire. And that I got from my friends because they wouldn't show that on the news. They would just show the flooding, or they would show a separate chemical plant with a fire, but they weren't showing them together, which was what was happening. The power transmission grids all went down while the same hurricane swung up into the Northeast and flooded the underground subway system, and numerous people in the hundreds died as illegally rented basements with no safe outlets, windows, or doors to the outside existed and ended up suffering from flash floods. The Midwest experienced deep flooding and tornadoes that drowned crops, and the wildfires of the West Coast, especially perhaps the Calderon fire that had swept into a tourist hub of Lake Tahoe, creating the havoc of trying to escape the flames. In one instance, school children were hastily evacuated across the street as their school went up in flames. And by the way, they were all evacuated safely. In the midst of ICUs and hospital beds and medical staff overrun with largely unvaccinated Delta variant cases of COVID, now we've got Omicron, wildfire smoke had also damaged many human and non-human beings. Quote, young kids are getting more and more admissions to the emergency room in the hospital with asthma exacerbations due to poor air quality, says Dr. Miki Sakdeva, a pulmonologist at Kaiser Permanente in Fresno, California. We're seeing more heat exhaustion and heat-related illnesses. And that's where the Ministry of the Future has the most impactful scene that gave me nightmares for weeks. I literally kept having that same nightmare of the opening of his novel. It was very intense and really felt like taking the fiction out of science fiction. With climate change happening, the number of these cases will keep rising. The International Code Red report released this past August revealed that temperatures have already risen 2 degrees Fahrenheit, with pockets of 3 degrees already. Reaching 3.6 degrees makes extreme heat events almost 14 times more likely. In our recent COP26, and I was during that time teaching a graduate course on Indigenous perspectives of climate justice and environmental justice, and had many of my students or family members, sisters, mothers, aunties, all kinds of relatives that were actually at COP26 and representing their nations there. And so they came into our class and really discussed with us, you know, some of the excitements, but also some of the real disappointments, and the need to have our voices in storytelling, Indigenous Futurisms, really talking about climate justice and environmental justice. The promises that were made by wealthier countries advanced themselves by conquest, displacement, and slavery as the fundamental basis of early to later forms of capitalism fell far short of both dates and timing and the amounts of actual cash infusion. As we well know, the conditions of our Anthropocene are experienced unevenly and profoundly shaped by ongoing forms of colonialism, extractivism, and racial capitalism. Anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and anti-capitalism explored in depth by historian Ibram X. Kendi and philosopher Alexis Shotwell in Perspectives and Controversies in Anti-Racist and Anti-Colonial Anthropocene for Compromised Times in the Anthropocene Review 2021. And then the Red Nation, who put together the Red Deal, Indigenous Actions to Save Our Earth, also in 2021, and also written by young Indigenous activists of, again, some of the students in my course either knew or had participated in this book. So I'm so excited about our younger generations. And I hope to mention a little bit more as we go along about that. So Red Nation and the Red Deal and Indigenous Actions both suggest that the intensity and scale of climate crises require equally powerful and sustained responses by activists, collectivists, and communities working side by side with scientists, artists, and creatives. And for us, that means the same simultaneously. For there is no neutrality or safe space, as there is also not for racism. It is either racism intertwined with climate and environmental injustices, or a struggling day-to-day anti-racism with stronger moves towards centering climate and environmental justices. And I argue that just the storytelling, because all of our science is, I grew up learning science through stories and loving so many different forms of science because of that. This to us, to many of us as Indigenous peoples, is a responsibility that no one, but perhaps especially us as leaders of sustainability, must center also. We already have territories, Indigenous peoples, I should say, that are 22% of the world, with 80% of our global diversity of human nations, animal nations, plant nations, water nations, and so on. Fortunately, not only climate and environmental justice, Indigenous activists and schoolactivists are working hard on this now, but Indigenous Futurisms as a movement of Indigenous sciences intertwined with song, ceremony, dance, drumming, visualizations, and story with stories. The high context of science art that Gregory Cajete, who you will know is a Pueblo himself, a Como Pueblo, speaks of, that has also become inundated with novels, stories, films, TV series, graphic novels, video games, musical compilations, poetry collections, experiments in 3D immersive digital experiences, art exhibits, social media areas, and so much more, are grappling with justice while also being forms of climate and environmental justice by their very existence. Gakina Wiwe, we are all related. As Melissa K. Nelson, who's also Nish, Anishinaabe and Métis, reminds us, quote, we are like trees with deep roots connected to our origins in the earth, in soil, in rock, and stardust. We come from strong trunks and numerous branches. We're like rivers flowing from humble springs, where fresh water emerge from primal wombs of fertility and rebirth. We are the result of all those ancestral waters flowing back to the liquid mother. As we travel down mountains and along riverbanks, flowing between roots amongst liquid minerals and sediments, we merge with all these stories, all those memories, all those life forces. As our waters flow and grow and transform, we make habitat for new life, for spawning salmon, for mating otters, for sparring dragonflies, and other animal delights. And that comes from the very beautiful collection, What Kind of Ancestor Do You Want to Be?, that was published in 2021. According to prophecy, 21st century Anishinaabe which is Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Adawa Native peoples on Turtle Island, are people of the seventh fire. We're the people of the seventh fire. In a time of remembering and repairing and revitalizing ancestral lifeways that were disrupted from over 500 years of colonization. We are preparing and hoping to light the eighth fire, a time of new people committed to peace and justice. To light this new, and prophecy says last, fire, we look to our human ancestors, especially the youth and more than human ancestors, to cosmogenealogies that remind us we are all related, Gakina Wiwe, to the trees, soils, seeds, and sacred sources of water and fire. In Anishinaabe Drew Hayden Taylor's Take Us to Your Chief and Other Stories, 2016, a whole collection. He's a humorist and a comedian, and really wanted to promote Indigenous Futurisms as well. And this is just a beautiful collection of stories and very humorous. Nimki, a young Nish boy, finds stars to be his close relatives in the story Stars. While the very humorous short story, Take Us to Your Chief, is about aliens visiting Earth who are struck by the wisdom of three Nish men who communicate only by shrugs and body gestures, since they know each other so well as friends. And so in fact, it's the aliens take them away because they decide that, well, they must be incredibly wise because they can actually communicate and talk with each other without speaking out loud. If you've been in any indigenous community at all, that happens, right? You're busy shrugging and laughing and making bodily gestures without having to express it. Now, growing up with his Aztec ceremonies, rituals, dances, language, and culture, Xutetzcatl Martinez, who identifies himself as Latinx indigenous, the executive director of the Earth Guardians, wrote between the ages of 16 to 19 his amazing We Rise, the Earth Guardians Guide to Building a Movement that Restores the Planet. And I just have to mention that Michaela Smith also just came out with a book. She's a Black American, Alaskan, who spent much time in indigenous villages there and then ended up becoming a climate justice activist because of that. And her book that just came out this past fall is called WELP, W-E-L-P, or is it W-H? I'll have to check. It's wonderful though, it's wonderful. And so what's happening is you have these young people. Well, I'm a Nokomis, a grandma, and so I think of them as young people, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, that are banding together and not only doing these incredible projects, not only writing these incredible stories. In fact, now there's even become a pattern, because I've sat on a lot of doctoral thesis committees now, and around the world globally for Indigenous Futurisms. And in many cases now, what is happening is that each person is not just a schoolactivist. They're not just being active, as Chase Weaver would say, in a communitist sense, where you have activism combined with community. And so that's Cherokee Chase Weaver's suggestion. You not only have that, but you have them creating, for instance, my own daughter, Bethel Pense, has done many kinds of indigenous video games. One actually, it's called When Thunderbirds Strike. that was actually brought up by a Republican senator to congressional legislation to try to have it listed as an eco-terrorist film or video game. And what it was based on is our concept of the oil and the pipelines is the big black snake, right? So in this particular Indigenous video game, you are able to tackle and take away parts of the black snake. But they didn't even take into consideration the most important facet of that video game is you restore Aki, the land, and maybe water. And thereby, through doing that, you're restoring plant nations, animal nations, and you can do that very, very specifically. So the activist aspect of it was misinterpreted, let's say. I will give it that kind explanation. It was misinterpreted. Okay, I'm gonna just jump here. You know, I've got way too much stuff, so I'll just throw you into a couple more things here. These impacts are felt globally. The Oktru Glacier in southern Siberia, a sacred site for the indigenous and self-sufficient Altai people, as an elder Oleg speaks of it, is the troublesome lack of respect for the spirits or bosses of these sacred places by tourists. In addition to the physical impact, the visitor's insolence leaves a heavy spiritual imprint on the land. When they leave, it is the local people who must deal with the consequences of their actions. This includes local shamans carrying out traditional ceremonies to restore the balance between local people, the glaciers, the mountains, and Altai. Ultimately, Oleg concludes, climate change is a symptom of people's ignorant actions upsetting the natural balance of life on Mitsukumikwa, Mother Earth. In the Altai traditional worldview, all natural things, whether planets or plants, bees or boulders, spiders or spirits, are recognized as conscious living beings endowed with all the functions, feelings, and follies of a person. For Oleg and his kin, Altai is a breathing and sensuous living entity with which, and Altai is the mountain, like the spirit mountain image we had earlier, with which they must keep the relationship in balance if they want to have a good life. If nature is not treated with reverence, reciprocity, respect, and restraint, the relationship becomes compromised, leading to environmental imbalance, such as climate change. And then I'm going to skip to this. And some of you may be familiar with this particular film that came out in 2012, the Indigenous Latinx and Koji peoples indigenous film, Gonenwindua, an Indigenous Futurisms film set in a future where Amamo, spirit leader and guide, sends his apprentice after 9 years of living in a dark cave to travel outside of the community, and his path leads to the digital panes of glass from leftover cities that still recite their welcome when he steps closely to them. But Mother Earth is again covered with green trees and blue lakes and rivers, along with the strange vanishing of the city peoples and decaying infrastructures of cityscapes due to climate change and renewal. And the young apprentice leaves offerings of fragments of ocean shells and thanks for the reclamation of the mountains, corridors, and ocean coral reefs, while also collecting medicinal plants to take back to his community. This film was created by the Koji people themselves and centers on the sacred mountain Sierra Nevada de Santa Maria, the highest coastal range in the world, which is considered by them as not only the center of the planet, the heart of the world, but also as the origin of all things. Their purpose in creating this film, after such a long period of isolation, they were not in touch, was a charge that they felt to warn all others about the serious impacts of climate change coming and already here. Since then, many books written by Indigenous peoples are also following this pattern with story, with nonfiction, with scholarly resources such as Jenny Bryant Tokolau's Indigenous Pacific Approaches to Climate Change. And note that many of us ended up becoming involved. I helped and was a part of that in protecting sacred mountains in Hawaii from the ever-growing huge telescopes set on top of these sacred places. I had the pleasure of seeing a quick screening of the now out feature-length Indigenous Futurisms film, Waikiki, by Indigenous Hawaiian filmmaker Christopher Kahunahana, which is now out. So you can grab that one. It's a really, really good one. Also works in LGBTQ IQ2 plus features as well. And this was, his film underlines what Candace Fujikane suggests, and this is another book I love so much, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, that also came out in 2021. This practice is a radical act in the face of settler capital's fear of an abundance that feeds. Since cartographies of capital enable the seizure of abundant lands by enclosing wastelands claimed to be underdeveloped, Kanaka Moali, or Native Hawaiian, map the continuities of abundant worlds. So vital to this restoration is the art of kilo, intergenerational observation of elemental forms encoded in stories, histories, storied sciences, chants, and songs. And I just want to mention that as a grandma myself in Nokomis, when we think intergenerational, we don't think of it in a strict, grandmother to mother to granddaughter kind of lineage. Our word kobade is a very simple expression, but expresses a really sophisticated concept for us. And it's the image often drawn with the image of an Nokomis, a grandma, holding her little one. But what's important about the image is that the grandchild is embracing back, is holding the grandmother back as well. In other words, we are all learning from each other. It's not just simply as Indigenous knowledge keepers, we are open to not only elders and elders' ways of thinking, but always with everyone. And that's the way my family was set up, the 9 of us. We made all our decisions together. And that's very niche. And I do that in my classes. We make all our decisions together. And that's Kobade. That's Kobade. Oh, here we go. Michaela Smith at 22 years old, one of our young activists for Indigenous and BIPOC climate justice, and the writer of WELP, W-E-L-P, Climate Change and Arctic Identity, 2021, writes about how this kind of abundance is not Mitsukumikwa, Mother Earth, damaging. For instance, the Alaska Native she grew up with and learned from revealed to her how the Canutsi Nation's way of life with sustainable living represents only 0.9% of the tonnage of fish caught in Alaska, compared to 98.6% or nearly 3.8 billion pounds of fish caught commercially. And this is something that you'll find over and over again. There'll be the sense of, oh, but you're going to take such a large portion of this. But when you look at the actual, and there is an Indigenous book on statistics, which is a beautiful one. When you look at that, you will notice that to live a well-balanced life is to use every part and feature of it. And as we have with Wobshabgog Rice, who is Anishinaabe also, and Moon of the Crusted Snow, a very famous Indigenous Futurisms novel at this point. When there's a strange power outage and they have no contact and no internet and they feel cut off from the rest of the world, what they do is they practice balance by when they are hunting or gathering plants or whatever it is that's been done, they make sure to give it to the elders in the community first. Then their enemies, anyone that they feel to have become a kind of enemy throughout or some kind of form of antagonism, you gift them next. And then you gift your own families and yourself. And that's just kind of a value that we carry with us. And it's greedy for us. That's what we really mean by the Wendigo. When I consulted for the film Antlers of Scott Cooper and Guillermo del Toro, I was explaining that to them, trying to explain that to them, that Wendigo is very real to us, but our ancient expression for that is greed. It's greed that opens you up to that all-consuming kind of power. Now, you guys, I have no idea. I have a bunch of stuff here where I could be giving all kinds of examples, but if let me just maybe, oh dear.
Would you like to open up to questions, Grace?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because I've got like many more pages here of like specific examples.
Okay. I have a question, first of all, right away.
Okay.
Let's see, could you tell me what the name of that gentleman is who wrote the humorous stories where the aliens visited the niche, guys? His name had Taylor in it.
Oh, yes, Drew Hayden Taylor, D-R-E-W. Hayden, Hayden.
Taylor.
And he's also a playwright, and he does many wonderful things, and has been a very strong proponent of Indigenous Futurism. Yeah, so I'll just open it up to, because I have I don't know what I was thinking here. I have many pages of examples. So it might be better to just have you guys go ahead and ask your questions, and we could, have more of a conversation or comments. Or would you like me to read some more?
Question.
Oh,
I don't know how to raise the hand in the Zoom. Hi. Even, English is not my native language, and I had a little of hard time getting all of this. It
Lo
is.
siento.
No, no, don't worry. It has been like, wow, wow. I cannot believe how many things indigenous people got in common. In just,
Yes.
come on, you're like million kilometers away. I don't know. Yeah, but that amazing sense of community, that hunger for stories, the hope and love that is all resistance about. It's crazy. It just blew my mind. Because it's not making war and making resistance only with weapons and fighting and destroying somebody else, but building.
Yes.
And I think that
Yes.
is, I don't know, I have no words, girl. I have no words.
I'm so thrilled. My auntie Grace, who just passed away from COVID, but at 98, so we nicht tend to, you know, we were not considered an elder until we turned 100.
Yes, especially
You
these
start
days.
at 50, yeah. So I'm only 14 years old right now. 60, no, 63. So I'm 13 years old right now. But she spent a lot of time just traveling. We Nish love to do that, and ended up with amazing communities, Quechuan, with the Quechuan peoples in Peru, and ended up spending about 30 years of her life there simply because she was finding incredible parallels and ways of thinking
Yeah.
and ways of sharing. So I just wanted to throw that in there as
It's maybe the connection with Earth. It's like a scientist. The subject of study is Earth. So it's hard not to get to the same conclusions, I guess. Harmony. I mean, it's just common sense to
yes.
and the Quechua way of because Peru it's a mega diverse country, super mega diverse, and we have different also people, communities, nations around, expressing hundreds of different languages too. Yeah, so we are also different, but our diversity that some people think it's something that take us apart, I believe is actually one strength. Okay.
Absolutely.
It's like an ecosystem. If you have two kinds of plants and two animals, it will be not a strong ecosystem. And I'm thrilled because it's something that we already knew. And why don't we don't knew that anymore? It's what is driving me crazy. Sorry. Sorry, I get over excited talking about this. Bruce knows this already. Absolutely. Come on, it's so basic. It's so simple. What's going on with us?
Yeah.
Come on, people, wake up. Oh, I'm like you. I'm telling the saddest thing and I start laughing because I don't want to cry. Yeah. But I think it's amazing. It's amazing of one truth that is underneath our skin. I have no very clear. Sorry to overshare with everybody. Blame Bruce. He knows that I love to talk. But one day in the planetarium, a lady that looks Asian, but I don't know the roots again. She told me, but what are you? And I say, what am I? A girl? I don't know. What do you mean, what are you? Are you indigenous? Are you Hispanic? Are you Latina? And I say, I don't know. I'm human, girl. I don't know. And I study and I start questioning myself. You know, that's a huge question. Who am I? And I say, who am I? Who am I? The racism, the classism in Peru that is stupid. Excuse me the bad word. I have words. But it's so stupid to be racist in a country like Peru that we are like 99.9999999% mestizo people. But still, how much more Indian than me you are, and it's crazy and it's stupid, and it's something that we got to fight for. But I think we have to do it with, again, love. Is we cannot continue fighting. It is and not end road. I don't know if I'm talking okay, sorry. Again, English not my native language, but it would take us nowhere, you know? And I think the hunger for stories, the hunger of people for meaning, because I think, like me, many mestizo people that is so messed up in the roots, so many echoes in the blood that we got, give us a little bit rootless. And we don't know how to find out our way back, right? I don't know if I'm expressing well, sorry if I'm not, but I hope that I can make up my mind. But I think we need to retrieve our roots or other roots. Why not? Why not a Navajo, Anita, here? And I will feel in my heart that your grandparents are like my grandparents, and I can still learn from them, because at the end it's the same roots. Come on, we all came from Africa, the deeper roots. Okay, everybody's human. The races are not real. The only race, according to science, not me, is human race, right? The other thing is the amount of, I don't know, melatonin in your skin that it's crazy. It's like makeup. It's stupid. How people say people of color? What color? I mean, we have thousands of colors. It's like a Pantone, right? Sorry, I'm getting overexcited again. But I'm thrilled because many things that I feel in my heart, that I talk with a lot of people with about, that is making a good living, that exists a word in Quechua, that is the summa causa, the good living, that is harmony, that is well-being, that is peace, that is love, that is all the wonderful things, but not only money. Yeah. That exists, that concept of a good living exists, not only here, but everywhere. So I'm, well, like this. Okay, sorry. I will shut my mouth now, and thank you so much for sharing. I'm overwhelmed. I don't write fiction, but I write poetry. Who writes poetry in this world? Okay, but okay. And the power, I think, of ancient languages, because our brain is format, it's wired according to your language. And for me, it's sad. My two grandmas and my mom speak Quechua, and they never taught me. And I speak Spanish now, only in English, yeah, but it will be so cool to have my wire here in Quechua. But yeah, I think we will have to look for new languages, and art is one more universal language. Music, painting, drawing. I don't know. So thank you again. I'm the cheerleader. Spirit. I don't know if I'm saying things that make sense to you, but okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Che McGretch, thank you very much. Oh, it looks like someone else wants to say something.
Gloria, I think.
Yeah, I would like to speak to connecting up, across our castes and all of our differences, because I grew up in a steel mill town, and it's currently the biggest steel mill in North America. I had asthma when I grew up. I spent almost a year in National Jewish Hospital for my asthma. And it was so polluted there that when they put a 24-hour filter to test how much the people I lived around, my grandparents, my mother, my father, and all of us, it filled up in 10 minutes. And it was so polluted. I mean, we had not only steel, but oil, mazola oil, and diesel, petroleum oil, and cement factory. We had everything there. So that didn't matter which race you are. And now those communities are mostly BIPOC communities, and they were mixed with Eastern Europeans more and Appalachian people when I was growing up. So, these things are hurting various groups of people, and you all breathe the same air that we breathe. It's the same air. So some of the people that are activists for environmental justice back in this Chicago industrial corridor that's east, northwest Indiana, are bringing in Native American people and Indigenous people, and they're all trying to work together because the earth is hurting there. It's very wounded in Gary. It looks like Chernobyl, Gary, Indiana. You can look it up. Looks like Chernobyl, 1,400 vacant houses and toxic, a lot of stuff. So we have to bring these people in too, because many people who are environmentalists have never lived in polluted areas, but most of the world's really poor people live in highly polluted, toxic environments as well. And so I speak from that perspective, although I'm melatonin deprived in some ways, but we all breathe the same air. And I know many of my friends who are people of color that I grew up with got diseases, cancers, died very young. So, it takes a real toll on us. And our speaker who's coming in April is from Bosnia, and his steel mill in Zenica, Bosnia, he said, is causing cancers, perhaps 1 out of 5 people. So Zenica, Bosnia, keep that in your thoughts too. They're having some issues with an older plant that hasn't been fixed. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is we intercross in so many ways, and I forget the word to use, the spirit of the phenomenal, not only the storms, but these wounds that are so deep from toxins that have gone into the earth affect all of us.
Are you originally from Gary, Indiana?
No, I went to school in Gary, Indiana. I was from East Chicago, next door to Gary, Indiana.
So in the early 70s, I was employed at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, and I would frequently fly out to a Western Electric plant in Indianapolis.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd spend a few days there. Then I'd drive up to the Western Electric Hawthorne Works in Chicago. And I remember repeatedly, I'd be driving north on this interstate toward Gary, go up to Gary, and then you take a left and go up to Chicago. And it would be this beautiful, pristine, crystal clear, visibility of a gazillion light years day in Indiana. But as I got about 30 or 40 miles south of Gary, I could see this brown cloud covering the entire horizon and extending up to about 10 or 15 degrees above the horizon. And then I'd drive into that, and it was like driving into a dense fog, but it was a brown fog. And it's something I've never forgotten.
Well, that's where I grew up, and I went to school at Indiana University Northwest in Gary. And so these hurting places are part of what we're trying to work together with people who came from the pure, natural places. But I would estimate that the poor people of the planet, many of them live in these very polluted places because that's where the few jobs that they are able to get. It's a form of industrial caste system like they have in India. Often people will say we don't have a caste system, but caste is very, very complicated to describe what caste is. I'm studying it now in its original home, which is India. And it's really,
Are you
we need to know.
Are you reading Isabel Wilkerson's?
I would tell you something about her book. It's a start, but it's very US-centric. It doesn't show a lot of knowledge of the global picture of caste and how when you go to a real caste situation like India, I'll have to send you some research from there, not from us over here talking about there. You know the difference because being Indigenous, you know the difference about us talking about there. But look up Ambedkar, the man who wrote the Indian Constitution was an untouchable. And there is a film in English about him called Ambedkar. He wrote their constitution. He was a brilliant man, but you know, it shows what he had to go through in the caste system. And I'm just beginning to touch on that, and somehow all of your positive values can kind of neutralize some of this because we've really got an invisible zone, places we just don't show in our media. I call it the media avoidance zones. Anywhere that's really destroyed by industry, we don't show. I tried to get Frontline to do a program on Gary. They have 14,000 vacant houses and the downtown is half gone, closing all their schools, people trying to tear down the houses, you know, but that's not interesting because there's always other things. And I gather there are a lot of these very, they used to be doing things and it put out a lot of trash into the environment. But then as we downsize, they're no longer even functioning, but there's still people living there. In a sense, that's like an industrial indigenous reservation. You know, the industrial version of an indigenous reservation is a town like Gary, because there's still 78,000 people, almost all Black, living there. And they shut down a lot of their schools and nobody talks about it. And that's where you know where the real problems are. It's where you aren't hearing anything, which was often the case with Indigenous people for most of our history. Even when we had broadcasting, we didn't broadcast about you. It was other people's views of you only.
Right.
And now you're getting, go ahead.
Oh, that's what we're hoping to do with climate and environmental justice. And actually, even the reason why I set up Walking the Clouds collection is because, and we're many nations, tribal bands, Anishinaabe peoples, were pretty huge. But we actually had all kinds of gatherings as Indigenous knowledge keepers, speaking and thinking this through. And what we call our Atazukana knowledge, which would be sacred knowledge, compared to Gikandasawa knowledge, which is everyday knowledge. And that is that through your language, as was mentioned earlier, by knowing Anishinaabe and knowing the plant, it's not that you just know the parts of the plants or the plant names, but you're actually learning about their toxicities and how to still use them after detoxifying them. So it becomes a very, very rich forms of knowledge that we agreed to give away. In other words, rather than just keeping our Atazukana knowledge or sacred knowledge to ourselves, we decided that based on this 8th prophecy, that it is time for us to share our knowledge globally. And that's been happening for a lot of Indigenous and First Nations peoples. The importance of it's important that we're not just poor, vulnerable, etc., even though Winona LaDuke has a great book on the militarization of Indian country and details how 90% of our uranium and uranium deposits are on tribal nation land, right, within the US. And I was thinking that in speaking of this, Gregory Ekahete, his definition of indigenous science has been developed uh, more recently in his book on communities. And he said that it's one that develops a comprehensive understanding of the history and ecology of a community and its economy. So good economics for hard times, for instance, by Banerjee and others, is a great example of that. He suggests we're realizing the conceptual framework of sustainability, so fundamental to our philosophies and sciences, that's giving us the greatest opportunity to apply and even evolve indigenous sciences. So one working definition he's developed over the years is a body of traditional, environmental, and cultural knowledge unique to a group of people that have served to sustain that people through the generations of living within a distinct bioregion. And that allows for, it doesn't mean that you were the origin or the very first there. We niche ourselves, we're voyagers. We used to be on the East Coast, and then we received prophecies and were told to move inland into the lakes, the many lakes area, and we followed that. And he says here that this body of knowledge, of traditional environmental and cultural knowledge, unique to a group of people that have served to sustain that people through the generations of living within a distinct bioregion. Well, we have at our own campus in Indigenous Nation Studies, we have Indigenous science courses where all are welcome. Everyone is welcome to come and learn. It's not kept as a secretive kind of thing. It's very, very much shared with the hope that we can mutually aid each other. And an example of that is Alexis Wright, who's Australian First Nation, in her Swan book. She's a member of the Wainai Nation of the Southern Highlands of the Gulf of Carpentaria. And her book, the Swan book, is set in a highly dystopic future where Aborigines are either packed into detention camps or finally bussed and trucked into a faraway in swamp, where tribal nations, the Australian government has given the sovereignty once the land becomes desolated, where they hide away, but the army finds them, practices with bombs in their area, and drags in the rusted, unusable boats, plastic debris, and other garbage floating in the nearby ocean, and deposits this all in their swamp, which then becomes inundated with toxicity. The same army flies over every night with huge beams of light to ensure that these terrorists, and as our silent young girl protagonist is assured by her Irish auntie Belladonna, anyone who is brown is automatically termed a terrorist, are remaining in their place, both physically and metaphorically. The novel draws upon the black swans that alight in the swamp and the journey this young girl takes, who has been found in an old sacred tree. His other definition, Indigenous science, is founded on a body of practical environmental knowledge that has been learned and transformed, because we're always adapting, over generations of a people through a form of environmental and cultural education that's unique to that people. And then that's where you have the idea of going back to Wabashud Grice's Moon of the Crusted Snow, when there is that loss of communication and power, the ways of knowledge and trapping, fishing, gathering, planting become really important elements of not just survival, but survivance. And with this is a distinct return to ceremonial practices that also enhances their success in getting through this turmoil. Quote, the sage smoke billowed high and dissipated. As it smoldered into ash, the scent weakened, giving way to the strong smell of wood smoke, now woven into the jackets and sweaters of the men and women in the crowd. As the community resumes sacred ceremonies and gatherings to discuss and share what needs to be done and how to justly share with all, including those who have become ill or are so elderly that they need assistance. It is this sense of community and mutual reciprocity for all human persons, animal and plant nations that helps get them through truly tough times. The essential thing, though, to the significance of Indigenous Futurisms is this final definition. Indigenous science may also be described as guiding thoughts or stories about the world, uniquely based on the lived experience of a group of people. Indigenous science is a process for exploring, understanding, and explaining the natural world based on this lived experience. Ambeline Kwaimolina of the Palalku people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia has written an exciting, adventurous YA series that explores this. It starts with Shala the wolf and goes on. And these are young that quickly grow in wisdom, whether they're a human person, a wolf person, machine person, angel person, or so on. They end up gathering together, cultivating, and sharing their experiences, stories, while interacting, shape-shifting, sometimes quite literally, with animal and plant nations. And so stories like that is the difference for Kahete, and this is what I wanted to get to, because I've been dancing all around this whole time, I think, is what are the distinctions between Indigenous sciences and Western sciences? There's a lot of overlapping, but there are also some differences. And the difference is what he calls high context sciences compared to low context sciences. Low context sciences are done in a lab or done in a taxonomic kind of way. Whereas high context are indigenous sciences themselves. They're a multi-contextual system, a body of knowledge built up over generations by culturally distinct people who live in close context with a place. And that's why we're so interested in a lot of Indigenous Futurisms now. A lot of the writers are also involved as activists for land back. That's a very, very strong movement that we have. And by land back, what we mean is things like national parks, which were taken from many of our tribal lands. It's Indigenous peoples that actually should be working in tandem with other communities to be able to use that land in the way that where you can gather, you can crop, you can tend, and you can avoid wildfires by the kind of burning methods that we used. And Bruce Pascoe in his Dark Emo talks about also for Australian First Nations, that the levels of burning that we've done are very important. For instance, so just recently through April 2019, the Balangara peoples, so this is fact now, not a fiction, as Indigenous rangers aided scientists all across tropical Australia in curbing and helping to halt the massive die-off of yellow-spotted monitors or lizards and quolls or meat-eating marsupials from an incursive invasion of gigantic alien cane toads with highly poisonous toxins. Thanks to the Balangara Rangers, many of the shy lizard peoples, hard to discern on the landscapes, were brought in and fed a small cane toad. It's kind of like vaccinations, you guys, to discern as a form of recognizing not to eat or touch cane toads at all. In an 18-month study of genuine cross-cultural collaboration, over half of the trained lizards, the shy lizards, knew to avoid the cane toads altogether, whereas those not trained died soon after the toads arrived. And then I went out to Australia, where at Macquarie University, they now have an actual center for Indigenous Futurisms. It's so exciting. And Claire Coleman, in her book Terra Nullius, she was there and confirmed with me, because I said, this is amazing, there's this scientific thing going on. And then she started laughing. She said, oh, that's actually my story. That's where I got it from. So when I say it's irresistible to see Johnny Starr spaceship going peoples, and so they're aliens, that come in this book Terra Nullius, written by a South Coast Noongar person, Claire G. Coleman. Terra Nullius, and that's empty land, void land, and has been used as a way of further colonizing areas. And so these spaceship going peoples resemble these invasive, gigantic alien toads. Although in this instance, Johnny's star-driven people cannot handle the harsh weather of deserts, as human persons go deeper and deeper into the bush. And speaking along the line of what you guys were bringing up, there's a sense at this point, and it's cleverly introduced much later in the novel, where you start realizing that the ones that are being driven out, you assume are simply Indigenous peoples or First Nations in Australia, but in fact are just generations and generations of human peoples that are now being forced into the kinds of histories like stolen generation and so many other kinds of things that have gone on. That the whole continent of Australia becomes the reserve for human persons, a practically uninhabitable space and place for the alien toads. So the alien toads, basically, they go everywhere else, and they're like, forget Australia. This is getting like too much of a desert for me here. We can't handle this. We've got to pull back. Becomes the reserve for human persons, a practically uninhabitable space and place for the alien toads. And it's reminiscent of Pagan Blackfeet Stephen Graham Jones' Indigipunk novel, The Fast Red Road, that was done in 2000, where Indian country is returned to all Indigenous peoples who can prove their authenticity, his great humor, by the appearance of pink eye. And this huge carved out territory is filled with gigantic spirit ancestors who fill some of the newer native returns. Because if you've got pink eye, then you're authentic and you're valid and you're allowed to cross. And there are these anthropologists, by the way, who are trying to wring their eyes like they have pink eye so they can sneak in to observe this Indian country nation. They fill even some of the newer native returns with utter terror and respect. The Menindewog, that's our word for native story giveaway, but it's done in a satiric kind of way, where you're kind of telling it satirically. In the latter novel is that the anthropologists that surround this Indian country hope to pass the carefully guarded security entrances of this huge sovereign nation by pretending to have pink eye, the new signature feature of being Indigenous. And I just wanted to add too, really quickly, that low context, when that's employed for Gregory Cajete, it narrows and reduces the number of contexts deemed relevant to a minimum. The value systems also tend to be very different. Western science tends to be empirical observation, quantification, and a quest for objectivity. That, I think, is changing. Indigenous science observation as well, but also guided by the values of spirituality, ethical relationships, mutualism, reciprocity, respect, restraint, a focus on harmony, and an emphasis on interdependence. All of us are directly linked to sustainability. And a quick example, when we start getting new scientific terms and ideas and concepts, Corey Gray, connected to the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Observatory, LIGO, as a Blackfoot scientist, shared the latest in gravitational waves coming from colliding black holes or crashing neutron stars with his mother, Sharon Yellowfly, who created a new lexicon in Blackfoot, such as Besatsassini, meaning Einstein's beautiful paintings, for his general theory of relativity. And I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing this. Abdudapsalbco Bigimixikat, and I apologize, but means they stick together waves, or gravitational waves, or black hole. Suguxia, along with a ceremonial dance contest and powwow with traditional grass dancers honoring this discovery of gravitational waves. In doing so, Corey shifted from a low context meaning of this discovery to the high context of indigenous enmeshed science. And that's what really Indigenous Futurisms is. The future of the planet needs to be shaped by an important balance of technology, media, innovation, and Indigenous wisdom. We've been so focused on growth, progress, and development that we've forgotten who we are. Humanity has left behind a lot of what makes us human, most importantly, our connection to the earth. Reconnecting to those ancient teachings and ideas can help us strike a balance between growth and development and the health of our planet. I'll stop there. Sorry, you guys.
Hi, that's great. That last part, I mean, that last part means a lot to me, because the stuff that I write, and Anna Marie maybe writes the same type of thing, but I do, cosmic poetry that's scientific, and at the same time is, relates to a higher consciousness. So what you just said is really, is very, very exciting to me. I'm going to look up the Blackfoot scientist you're talking about, because I think that would be, that would really be meaningful to me. So thank you for that. That's wonderful. And I know. And the last thing that I wanted to say was that when you talk about indigenous connected to the earth, it's also indigenous connected to the stars.
Yes.
To the cosmos.
Yes. Absolutely.
Thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mind mentioning your name and also the titles of some of your poetry that you've written? Or whatever.
Well, the poetry isn't ready yet. The poetry, I've tried. Yeah, the poetry will be, by next time I will be ready with it.
Okay.
But I had an experience of cosmic consciousness, cosmic calling 40 years ago. And I had been trying to bring it to the public so that I'm not a flake, but that people can really relate to what happened to me. And working with Willie Whitefeather, working with what's her name? Carol Locust. I don't know if you knew Carol Locust.
I know Carol Locust.
Yaqui Tribe. Yeah, at the University of Arizona. Right.
I used to work at Johnson.
Yeah. That's familiar, but those were the two people who I worked with for the books that I did, which was really for kids. But include the one that I did the best with was an American Indian Sign Language. And where I try to do, signs of the earth. But it's too much to give you here. So if you send me an email, Or if you just put your email address, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
But really wonderful to hear you today. Thank you.
Oh,
Yes, I knew Carol Locust. Karen, she worked at Johnson O'Malley Title IV. That was Native American Studies at Tucson Unified School District when I worked there as a tutor, tutoring Native
Right.
Americans. And her son died during that period. I remember that. He had massive disabilities from sniffing paint as a child. And I went to his funeral. It was very moving because they had all the Native American traditions there.
Wow. Who did
That's
she have she also had a sister who was a poet, didn't she? Carol Locust?
Yeah, she did. And I think her sister was at the son's funeral and read some of her poetry, if I'm not mistaken. Remember, this is the early 1980s, so my memory may not be that complete, but she's a lovely, lovely woman. And she came in her full, Native costumes, and she did feathers and sent, the smoke things that you do when someone dies. And I remember it was a very moving ceremony. I actually tutored her son, who was so disabled, but he was a wonderful kid, and his name was Key. He went by Key. I think he had a longer name, and he died during the period that I was working there.
Interesting. I knew her in the 90s. That was when I did all of my Native American books.
Well, I hope I can get everybody connected to everybody. I've been trying to make notes, but I don't have everybody in my system yet. So let's see, Anna, I guess we're going to be getting her email. And well, Karen, you want me to paste? Why don't you paste your email in so that you can be in touch with Grace? You just have to type your email in, and then she can look at chat and she can copy it down. And I think that's the easiest, rather than me writing to you and then sending it to her, There you go. So now you can just get it from that.
oh, okay.
And just
Thank
copy
you.
it down,
I'll put it
KM Liptak at Comcast.net. Oh, KM Liptak at Comcast.net. So Nancy, I hope you enjoyed it too. It looks like we're winnowing away one by one here. But
I did, especially when you talked about areas where you grew up. I grew up in suburban Pittsburgh back in the 50s.
oh yeah.
And that was, I remember my dad telling stories of when he needed flashlights and streetlights on to go to work at 9 in the morning downtown in the 30s when it was really bad.
Well, I'm
So
editing a book called Children of Steel. It's short fiction of people who grew up in steel mill towns. And
yeah.
many of the stories deal with the effects of pollution and what have you.
But
fact,
well, of course, there were those of us like me that once I hit 18, I was never really back there other than some graduate work at Carnegie Mellon. But
well, the one woman who won our prize is a lifelong resident of the Pittsburgh area, and she wrote a great story called Steel Valley about 3 generations of people who worked in the steel mills. And I have feelings about them as well, because even if we are very back to nature, if you look around yourselves, there's a lot of steel. We're all using a lot of steel, so we have to.
well, my dad worked at that when he put himself through college, and he used to work in the mills.
I hope they come up with a green, and none of these people I'm talking about in these steel mill communities is anti-sustainability. They would be much happier to work in a much more green, for a different kind of alloy that wouldn't put.
Well, of course, Pittsburgh's just really been cleaned up since then.
Yeah, but they don't have jobs. That's the kind
I
of.
know a lot of people like my sister who retired there, but
That's
become
the
very
problem,
senior slanted.
We need to have some kind of sustainable economy that will find employment for people who are already disadvantaged because they grew up. And you heard, I wasn't prompting him, Jim Doty was telling you about Gary, and that's often what I hear from people who are not from Northwest Indiana. And, you know, if you spent your whole, I lived there for 23 years in that era.
I
So-
remember friends of my mother's that we used to visit, and a lot of these places got torn down when they built the big ballparks.
Well, they still have the largest functioning steel mill in North America, or the northern hemisphere is in East Chicago. It hasn't gone away. I mean, I hear stories, oh yeah, they used to. Right now, even
Right now, yeah.
even in Gary, they put out hundreds of tons of steel a year, but with robots. So these African Americans that live in the city next to the steel mill and get, you know, the bad side of it, do not have jobs because of automation. So, you know, some of them are trying to do urban gardening, what they can do, you know, because the ground itself isn't what you can grow organic things in.
It's polluted.
And some is more than others, you know, as you get further out of the plume or whatever you call it. But some of these African Americans, they're trying very hard. They're not just sitting there. They're doing survivance in their own way. There's Gary version of survivance, and I'm pulling for them, and that's why I put in my time to try to do this story, because you're at a disadvantage in a caste system if you work in a dirty trade. Think of India. Who is the lowest caste? The people that work in the dirty trades. You know, the people that pick up the sewage of the other people and various dirty trades, because the Hindu Vashyas, the system of caste is all about purity, and the higher caste you are, the more pure you are. So, you know, that's a different way of slice. It's all the same apple, different ways of slicing it. None is, you know, privileged over the others, but I'm just saying that because of where I grew up and having asthma and everything, I tend to not, it's like when you say, I can't forget my own people. You know, I can't forget my own people because they were, and I know some people spend a tremendous opioid, what do you call it, growth of opioids, because they don't have a future. And so these things are very important to look at from the various angles. And we have so much to learn from each other. And if we could cooperate instead of constantly, you know, going at it, we could solve some of these things.
Oh, yeah, I loved her story about the terrorist claims for a video game.
The video game, yeah. Oh, and I should thank you.
Unbelievable.
Before we sign off or do anything else, I want to thank you so much. This is one of our most memorable ever presentations, I think, that we've ever had. And you're going to have it out forever, hopefully forever, on YouTube pretty soon. First, it will, when we shut off, it'll process it, and then I can do things and upload it into our YouTube channel. And I'll send you the link for that, Grace, so that however many people you know. So,
you know, one thing struck by with the people that were here, or maybe people have left at this point, but the reference to writing books for children or doing children's literature, that's a huge, huge area for us with many of our native presses, whether it's Red Planet for comic books or Thetis Press.
I know it's going on in Tucson. You know, they have something called Owl and Panther you can look up. It's native people's. Have you heard of Owl and Panther? It's a biggie.
Yes, I have because of Lee Francis.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and see, they're all about keeping, and I used to teach, believe it or not, when I worked at Johnson O'Malley, I had been a spinner. I picked it up since I was in Arizona, spinner, and I learned how to do a Navajo spindle, and I was actually teaching them their own craft at one of the city schools. The kids at Ritchie Elementary had never seen, they were urban Indians, you know, urban, we said Indians, they all say Indian. We were urban indigenous. So the kids were there watching me be the person showing them how to do Navajo spindle. And, you know, normally it was their own folks, but nobody else in Tucson, evidently in that group, knew how to do it. So I had been, as a hobbyist, you know, just picked it up. And these were important. I thought, this is sad that they need, you know, me to, but I think some of the other women have probably taken it up now.
I think too, that's Kobati, right? That's where you're helping each other out mutually.
Yeah.
And and they, by being a humble ally, which I know that you are, Gloria.
I
And I
try.
really
They
appreciate
saved
that.
my life. I'll go into it some other time, but my husband had died and I was a new widow. And I literally think that my job at Johnson O'Malley saved my life because he was very young when he died and suddenly. And, you know, so I always remember that of them.
Oh, oh, yeah. So I think that's, you know, I hope that's the message that even with Indigenous Futurisms, where you're doing it from the standpoint of an Indigenous person as you write the story, and then it flows out in this near future. One of the trends that I see, even though I'm on the ethnic board for the International Space Station,
Mhm.
and so we have many conversations and discussions about that. Most Indigenous futurist writers at this point, and I've pulled together a ton of them to write about for various compilations, tend to, if there are space moments, because there definitely are, or spaceship moments, they're often quietly undercut by having, like, say, in one story, there's an AI. It takes a long time, and this AI accumulates human memories, histories, feelings, but comes back to Mitsukumakwa, comes back to Mother Earth, and finds that there are indigenous peoples. Now, it doesn't say specifically indigenous, but from the way they're described, you get the sense, and they've been living underground.
Mhm.
And this is after thousands of years, right? Of you know, because it would take that at least to recover.
Mhm.
But they are there. And so one of the things that's decolonizing the Anthropocene is to not immediately do the old narcissistic colonial SF tropes that John Reeder talks about, where you're going out, you know, on a conquest to create a new frontier, you know, all of the other kinds of things. In fact, in our Science Fiction Research Association, what used to be the final prize for scholarship was called the Pioneer Award.
Mhm.
And by having more and more Indigenous futurists in the midst, they suddenly realized, oh my goodness, that's actually a painful term. That is not a comfortable term. And you know, it's the one where I was saying, if I ever get that, I'm going to decline it because of the name. You know?
Yeah, Pioneer. That's funny because I have put our group, I'm a member also of the Science Fiction Research Association.
Okay.
And yeah, and I told them about this group, so you're available to them now if they're keeping tabs on it. Hugh,
Yeah.
Hugh O'Connor, whatever his name is, you know, said I'll put it out to the group so they know about your videos that we're making.
Sure. And it
So,
was Karen, who was our president at the time. I love her so dearly, from Haifa University in Israel, who was the proactive president that got that name changed. She just put it out as a question, and everyone was very sympathetic and responsive. And, you know, it's just like one of those blind spots, right? Where you're not thinking about it until it's brought to your attention.
Different people have their different words that set them off. It's really funny because my sister's in a different political, you know, configuration mostly than I am. And she has her words. She just wrote me back because something I said, well, she said, that's the equivalent of your word that you don't like, blah, blah, blah. This is the one I don't like. So, you know, it's sort of a negotiating. I think it's where we draw the line in the sand and say, I don't mean about pioneer, I'm not talking about that, but
Right.
you know, we can then look at it. It's just like what's going on, you know, in the big let's fight over Ukraine. It's called negotiation. Otherwise, it's called bombing. You know, there's like not too many other things we can do here. So I'm all in favor of the rhetorical making improvements, as you say. And I think anyone's feeling that this word hurts me should be respected. And think of another word. Why do you have to force this word? I know I saw it was funny, and I won't keep you because I know you all want to go, but I posted a picture of a blue-footed booby, and that's what it's called. It's a bird, and it's very cute looking. It has a spoon bill and big blue, you know, webbed feet. And I put under it, I bet that's not what it calls itself. It doesn't call itself a booby. And some human made up that name because it's kind of awkward looking. And that's a very important point. That isn't probably what the boobies refer to themselves as. They have some nice, very nice name. So, well, do you have any concluding remark before we go, or anything to?
The one thing that there's just too much, but I was thinking that there seemed to be an interest in physics here and science as well.
Sure.
And usually for us with quantum physics, there's a fairly new book out called Sand Talk. And it's by an Australian First Nations, and I should look up the rest of the title for you guys. But if you just click in Sand Talk, you will find his book. It's an amazing book written where he brings you through many kinds of forms of science, both with mathematics, with quantum physics, and other kinds of aspects, and he does it from an Australian First Nation point of view.
That's excellent. Excellent.
And
Wonderful. Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that book.
Well, I'll try to get, I'm not sure how best to do this. I might be able to have it as an attachment, you know, when I send out the next, if you have a list of things. And you could get it to me, and I'll attach it to our next, you know.
I could create a little bit of a list. Yeah, at this point, there's over 1,500 scholarly essays.
Well, just some of the ones you mentioned, you know, one about Mr. Taylor, who wrote about the niche and the Going to Window Rock, or whatever that Indigenous film was, and there were a few of them. So, you know, whichever ones you can remember that you mentioned in the talk, that's all.
Sure.
You know,
and anyone is welcome to email me to say, oh, you were kind of talking about this, or I was interested in that, and then I can give you a ton of titles.
Right. The only problem when we hear it, you can't spell it sometimes, you know, so it's important to have a paper, a visual, you know, on the names and stuff.
Well, I'm a Newcomer. My grandma. So
Me too. I'm not a grandma, but I'm of the age where I could be one. So anyway, I want to thank you immensely, and from a galactic size thank you here from our group, because everybody was sending me emails, private ones. I have to go, but this was the best. Oh, this is the best ever. So they really loved it.
Oh my gosh, that is so kind. I felt like I was starting to jump into a point, and then, you know, had, you know, an entangled web.
Well, I think that, you know, you brought so many, it's like the pomegranate of ideas that Ray Bradbury talked about. You brought this pomegranate and you were just plucking little seeds, and these all can grow, all of these seeds. So we want to thank you. I'm going to break it off now because most people have to do their lunch or midnight dinner or whatever. Over Ian is from South Africa. It's probably middle of the night for him, but thank you so much, Grace. And we will be in touch and hopefully have you back at another time. You were really a big head here.
And Shay McGwetch, to everyone who is here and had such thoughtful comments or questions or just brought up stories. My mind was kind of exploding in 1,000 different directions as I was hearing
Well, she
points
did a good
made.
job, and we got a lot. It was so substantive. So how do you say, you know, farewell or we'll see you again in Anishinaabe?
Oh, okay. Okay, here's an interesting thing. We say anin,
Ani?
A-A-N-I-I-N, which
Mhm.
means I see the light in you when we are first gathering together and I'm seeing you.
Mhm.
That's the way we say hello. I
Ani.
see the light in you,
Ani.
anin.
Mhm.
But then we take that word, anin, and then we add in a new word, I-K-O-D-E, anin ekode, and then that means take care.
Okay.
And then one of my favorite expressions is manajiyang, which means we hold each other up.
Manaj Idiya.
Yeah, you know what? I'll write that in the
The list.
In the list, yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to say at this point, Anin Ikode, and do a Vulcan, you know. thing here. See you soon, guys. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.